I love seeing a big, impressive army of miniatures come together, and generally speaking, the more bodies, the more awesome it is. But my favorite part of painting up a horde of plastic dudes is the characters. Painting a single 32mm miniature is my bread and butter. If there's one thing I'm confident in, it's my ability to create an interesting single fig. And in today's video, we're not painting any old model, but the leader of my entire Warhammer 40k army, my Archon. I'm gonna show you guys how you can take a scheme for your army and spice it up for a display model. Let's get crackin'! Release the Kraken! In the past, I've made a video with pretty much this exact topic, examining how to zhuzh up a Sister of Battle scheme, and I'll link that video below. But in today's video, I want to explore how we can improve a miniature from a modeling perspective with some kit fashion. I'll definitely be changing the scheme as well, so not to worry. All right, Mini family, it is week 3 of the Dark Eldar Army project, Miniac.co. And I have a bit of a confession to make. It's not Monday, but it is Wednesday. I donated 2 days of this week to working more on the Raiders and Ravagers so I can get them to where I got them in last week's video. But I think 3 days is enough to convert and paint a single figure. We're starting off strong on Wednesday though. It's nice and early, so let's get after it. My first step when doing a conversion where I don't have an idea already formed is a little bit of R&D. I want to grab every single model that I've assembled, all of the bits I've left over, the sprues that I have stuff hanging around, boxes. Basically, everything in this office is fuel for my conversion fire, and I don't want to be picky. I don't only want to look at Dark Eldar stuff, but I want to look at all kinds of different stuff. I want to constantly be imagining my Archon, forming it in my head, asking, does this arm work? Does this head work? Does this bit work? And anything that's even slightly interesting, I'm going to pull out. For Dark Eldar conversions specifically, oftentimes stuff like Dark Elf bits or Vampire bits work really well because they share a lot of the same design motifs. For example, this Dark Elf character from Silver Tower could 100% drop right into the world of 40k as some kind of succubus or the leader of a witch unit. No conversion even needed. Sometimes what this process looks like is just sitting and staring as you mentally construct your kit bash in your head. Give yourself some time to cook here. This video is focusing a lot on the building aspect of the miniature painting hobby, which is perfect because today's sponsor is the Woodworkers Guild of America, your online resource for woodworking instructions, ideas, and information. Even though I mostly paint miniatures on this channel, I've been known to dabble in carpentry, trying to make my own board game tables, hobby case, and paint desk. In fact, the desk that I'm sitting at right now, and have been for the past 7 years, was based on plans from a woodworking YouTuber. And you can find the likes of Jimmy DiResta, a YouTube carpenter, in instructional videos on the Woodworkers Guild of America. Right now, I'm trying to refinish a vintage piece of furniture, working with oil-based polyurethane for the first time. And I have a newfound respect for people who can get flawless results. I watch a lot of carpentry content online, and one thing that everyone glosses over, pun intended, is finishing. So the first place that I headed to when I got access to the WWGOA community was the finishing section, so I can get some straightforward and exhaustive information on the skill to figure out where I'm going wrong. But maybe you're not into refurbishing furniture like me and instead want to impact your hobby with some carpentry skills. George Von Driska has a nice long video on how to build a sturdy bench with accessories, a super helpful tool when steadiness is important painting tiny figures. Woodworkers Guild of America is always creating new premium videos to keep you coming back for more and help you stay inspired. The first 1,000 of you that click the link in my video description will get a full year of premium membership to the Woodworkers Guild of America for only $1.49, valid for new members only. All right, back to working on my Archon. All right, some plans are forming in my head, but I'm stuck between 2 different ideas. One, kind of more of a piratical vibe with the Corsair bit with the eye patch and the Trueborn bit with the bird, or more of a faceless, muscle-bound freakazoid. I think the pirate option is the safer one, but the muscle-bound freak is the one that's exciting me more. So the shtick with my army is that they stole a sun to harvest its power, but ultimately failed and it ravaged their portion of the webway. Now, of course, the hubris of Dark Eldar is at an all-time high, and who is the most hubricious? Hubricity? Hubricaic. The worst among them has got to be the leader, the one whose idea it was. So the idea of this guy being bare-chested in an area with a UV index of 1 million just seems like the most stuck-up and snobby thing ever. But he'd be getting messed up, which is why his skin's all wrinkly and he's got combat drugs everywhere. I'm sold. This idea is doing it. Let's work it out. The one problem with the rack body is I bought these as bits, so I don't have the part that is supposed to cover the gaping hole on the back of the model. So we need to get a little creative. To cover up the gaping hole from that missing part, I found this gun bit from what I think is the Talos paint engine kit. I think the segmented armor of this gun part looks awesome, and I should be able to cut it off and use it. It's even big enough to have more of those vials of combat drugs attached to it, which works perfectly with the motif we're working with right now. First, I hacked off the parts on the back armor that I wouldn't need, like the guns. To do this, I used a hobby saw with a super thin kerf. The more teeth, the better in my experience. With that done, I then glued the halves together and set it aside for that glue to totally set up and cure. On to the next hack and slash job. The first thing I wanted to do to the rack torso and legs was get rid of the legs. He's got bare toes showing, and as much as I love the Jesus the Carpenter aesthetic, I'm gonna go with more of an armored look for my Dark Eldar. After chopping off the bulk of the legs with my side clippers, I then resorted to the bull gouge in my Dremel to hog out the rest of the material. And I cut away a lot more than I thought I would need because this is the inside of the lower half, and you're not even gonna see it anyways. More space, the better for conversions. Next, I found some armored Cavalite warrior legs that I liked and cut off the foot. This guy has more of a walking straight forward pose, and those legs have the typical Cavalite warrior doing splits vibes, and by removing the foot, I have a nice straight leg that I can use. With a lot of the plastic removed, I could begin gluing parts back together, starting with his left leg. And I used some sprue glue here to build up some more plastic for a nice strong bond. I was constantly referencing against the other half of the legs just to make sure that I got the length right and the rotation right. This is also a good opportunity to make this guy a little bit taller than my typical Cavalite warrior by just simply extending this leg a little bit further. With the leg in its final resting spot, I can now add on a more flat-footed Cavalite warrior foot to set the full length of his legs. With that determined, I can reference that leg when doing the other one. I can now move on to the right leg of his, which is kind of more on the back foot with a bent toe. I harvested the foot of another unfortunate Cavalite warrior and then cut it at the ankle and pinned them together to get the positioning and angle correct. I'm not gonna lie, this part of the conversion is super tedious. There's a lot of fitting with poster tack, shaving away at areas until things fit and feel like they're in the right pose. Lots of back and forth. But when everything feels right, I glue it all in with a lot of sprue glue to strengthen up that joint, just like with the other leg. I'll let that plastic cement set up with him standing upright so I know I have a nice flat surface to glue to a base. All right, back to that backpack. With the glue on the turtle shell dry, I start to remove a lot of extra material inside of it, again with the bull gouge in my Dremel. With all that excess removed, I can much more easily shape the sides of the shell to match the profile of his torso. I do this shaping mostly with files, but also with an X-Acto knife. When it feels mostly right, I glue it in place with some plastic cement. Now it's time to fit the face onto the existing neck stump on this torso. Taking a look at the bit that I want to use from the Cavalite Trueborn Kill Team kit, I cut the head down appropriately, and I just keep shaving and shaving until it kind of fits, and then I stick it all together with a ton of sprue glue. Probably a little bit too much. I kind of want all the goop to fill in the cracks nicely and squish out slightly. Then, when it's fully dry, I can sand it back with a sponge sanding twig. It's the next day now, and all the plastic glue is fully cured. Time to deal with the gap in between his backpack and his back. Beginning with some guitar cable, I bend it around a round handle brush. Then I cut a much shorter segment of it and bend it even tighter with some bent nose pliers. With two of these, I kind of just shove it in the gap in his back. I feel like cables like this make sense for the flesh crafting cults of Camorra. To continue that idea, I drilled 2 holes into his head that will eventually receive some cables. I'm intentionally drilling these asymmetrically so he doesn't look like he has pigtails. Although, that would be pretty cute. Then, with some hollow brass pipe, I cut a super small little piece. That little coupler gets put into the hole, and then inside of that pipe, I use some aluminum wire and bend it into his backpack. Aluminum wire is an excellent kit bashing material and is so good for doing little cable runs. It's so easy to bend and looks very convincing. It's quite soft, so it mars quite easily even with tweezers, but a little bit of sanding and that goes away nicely. Here's what 2 of those cables all cleaned up looks like. With the cables in the head looking good, it's now time to move on to the hole in his back. I shoved some crumpled up sculpting mesh into the hole just to act as a backing and superglued it in place. And then, with some Tamiya putty, I thin it with some acetone and place that in the hole. The only reason I'm using Tamiya putty here as opposed to something more conventional like Milliput is because I'm impatient and this stuff dries super fast to a sandable finish. Speaking of, let's sand it smooth. This is definitely a job for one of the sanding twigs as the sponginess of it conforms to the round shape of the shell nicely. I also used some styrene to add some more cables to his head that were a different width, just to get a little extra variety. With the hole filled and nicely sanded flush on the back, we can start to add some details. And I begin that by marking out some holes with my X-Acto knife, and then drilling them larger with my pin vise. One thing I love about conversions, and honestly also painting, is that you create the story for your character as you're making him. I put this big shell thing on his back because there was a big hole that I needed to cover. And I started to put these combat drug vials on the backpack because there was a lot of surface area to fill up with interesting detail. And there's also cables running from the backpack as well. And now all of a sudden in my mind, I'm like, oh, he has like a giant power pack like Space Marines, but instead of it being like an energy source, like in a battery sense, it's an energy source in like a drug sense. You know, Space Marines are probably on drugs too, now that I think about it. But I just love that process. And it goes both ways too. Sometimes you have a background idea for your character and you seek out parts to fulfill that narrative. But in this case, it was the opposite. And I think that's just so much fun, honestly. With the putty on the backpack drying, I also decided to do more sculpting work while I was waiting. For this job, I chose Tamiya QuickType. QuickType is like the best of both worlds when it comes to Milliput and green stuff. When it is uncured, it is very smoothable and kind of elastic and stretchy. And then when it fully cures, it's very hard, making it sandable, which makes it really easy to conform it to a surface when you're trying to fill a gap like this in his ankle. But it does take a lot longer to cure than the Tamiya basic type, which is the putty. With the bulk of the conversion done, let's finish it off by gluing on some arms. And I picked a pistol and an awesome Butcher Cleaver-esque sword from the Cavalry Trueborn Kill Team kit. I love the armored arms with the bare chest. It reminds me of like a gladiator or something. And it also brings it back into the world of this is an Archon and not just like a beefy homunculi or something like that. With them all done, it's now time to turn my attention toward the base. In an effort to make this guy taller, I broke out some cork and frayed the edges to make sure they fit on the base, and it also were in a good spot for his legs. With those glued down, I also glued down some succulents from Epic Basing, and then followed that up with some texture paste to hide some of that cork texture, but also blend all the elements together nicely. Lastly, with that texture paste all nicely set up, I took my dirt mixture, which is a bunch of different sizes of grains, and glued it down for some variety. While working on the base, he was kind of just staring me down a little bit, and there was a problem that I had to fix. His arms just felt a little too small for his meaty torso, so I tore those arms off as much as I liked them and replaced them with a different arm from the same Cavalry Trueborn Kill Team kit that just angles the arm in a different way, showing off more of the width of his bicep, and also one of the beefier arms from the Witch set for his pistol. That looks a lot better. With the base done, I can now pin my Archon into the cork and then get to priming. I chose to prime this model in black. We're not batch painting a bunch of dudes, and this guy doesn't have one color on him that is overwhelming all the rest, so I'm not gonna lean on the airbrush much for this. Black's nice because it hides all the areas where I'm not gonna reach with my brush, like inside of his skirt, where you can definitely tell that his leg attaches to literally nothing. Don't tell anyone. After the primer is dry, we're going to start working on his skin because it's most central to the model and hardest to reach. I'll grab some sickly skin tone colors and start with a base coat of a dark, desaturated blue. If you've seen the video of me painting a Kronos, this palette will be familiar. After that base coat was nice and dry, I started to get on into some highlights. I mixed something of a desaturated, pinkish skin tone into my blue to get brighter and brighter colors. This guy has quite a wrinkly chest with lots of recessed detail. And I want you to notice how on this first layer and even some of the second layer, I'm running right over all of those recesses. I leave some stuff behind on the lower surfaces that are facing the ground, but anything facing up gets totally base coated basically. If I were to leave dark thin blue lines in every single one of his stretched skin detail, by the end when I want to get to more of a skin tone color, it wouldn't look like that. He would look almost like a zebra. Obviously, as you get higher and higher, your highlights get brighter and brighter. But what's a little bit more confusing is as you get higher and higher, your shadows also get brighter. The shadows in the creases of his bulbous neck fat are going to be brighter than the shadows under his pectoral muscles. Keep that in mind next time you're highlighting and shading a model. I continue to mix more of that Caucasian-ish skin tone into the blue, getting brighter and brighter, but also more warm and lifelike. With that increase in brightness, my highlights get smaller and smaller. Despite what I said earlier about not wanting this guy to end up looking like a zebra, he kind of still is. Even though I've made this mistake a million times and am aware of it and try to deal with it, I still mess up. Each time I make that mistake though, I improve a little bit each time, hopefully getting closer and closer to truly understanding that idea. To fix that mistake though, I just take some watered down, brighter skin tone and kind of just glaze it over the whole thing. I just want to lighten the shadow a tiny amount. With the skin looking pretty done, I want to add some bruised and gnarly flesh. With some thinned out red, I just glaze toward the areas where it looks like mechanical bits are grafted on or grasping at flesh. I want to keep this effect tight and also very saturated. There's not a whole lot of skin tone showing, so I don't want to cover up everything that's there. But I want the inflammation that is there to be very vibrant and visible. Because ink is so liquid as well, you can kind of wash it into these areas and it settles nicely. With the skin done, it's now time to move on to the armor. And here's where we're going to change up the scheme from my normal army a little bit for this display model. Khaki is a huge part of my Dark Eldar army, and I'm going to definitely use it here on this model, but I'm going to start with more of an orange color this time. Orange is a hue contrast to blue, which is found in the skin and also found subtly in the black. Now, I don't want this armor to look orange in the end, but I want it to subtly show up in the shadows of the khaki as well. That's one way in which I'm going to zhuzh up this paint scheme for our display model when compared to my normal dudes. For the next layer on the armor, I mixed an intermediate tone between that base coat and also a khaki color. I'm pretty much doing an all-over layer of this color other than on the backpack. The backpack is a big, nice volume that at the very bottom of it points straight down to the earth. So I kept that part pretty dark. And I'm trying to do more of a gradual gradient from the top of the armor panels to the bottom. I'm also leaning into more of a brighter color with this layer because I know I need to give myself some headroom to work in some white highlights and also some brighter khaki highlights. So this color looks khaki and not peach at the end. Lighter colors like creams and whites take on colors like orange, green, and blue in a very big way. And oftentimes, if your goal is to have a cold shaded white and you start from a blue place, you end up with more of a baby blue than anything resembling white. So again, to avoid that, I'm using a brighter than normal second layer here. For the next layer, I'm using pure khaki, and I am trying to do some blending between this color and the next one, trying to obey the volumes on this model. On the big volume of his backpack, this type of process just takes a long time. I'm gonna do a bit of wet blending, let it dry, do the exact same wet blend again, adjust it with some glazes, feather in some brighter highlight. There's lots of back and forth. All told, by the end of this process, it took me about an hour and a half to paint just the white armor. Ooh, okay, I have a confession to make. It is Monday, and it is Monday at 1:15 p.m., and I'm still working on this guy, and I was supposed to be on to the next project. I had a lot of non-painting things to attend to this Monday morning, but we're gonna try to get this guy done with the rest of the time that we have, and then start strong on Tuesday for next week's project. All right, let's get it on. Next up in the armor highlighting process is to bust out the titanium white to mix that with the last layer of paint that I was using. And then I'll carefully apply some of that paint to the highlight areas, clean my brush out, and then feather the transition into the previous dry layer. Very often I do that exact step multiple times just to reach the correct opacity with this brighter paint. While doing this, I also highlight all the tiny little rivets all over his armor, and I'm gonna throw it over to Live Scott for a demonstration. GW minis have tons of little rivets like this, and a great way to enunciate them is by having a little ring shadow right around them. But it's ridiculous to expect anyone to actually paint a perfect circle around them. And so a much easier way to do that is you can approach it in two ways. You can water down your shadow color, which in my case is kind of like an orangey brown thing, and wash it onto the rivet, kind of like this. So you can see I have a dark ring around the rivet, and where it was white, it's a little bright spot on top. Or you can just skip the whole washing thing and just paint the whole rivet a dark color, and then when you come back with white paint, you can just not push down fully with your paintbrush. Of course, the more you push down, the more the bristles of your brush splay out. So the tiniest tap will be enough to maintain that shadow. You want some good amount of paint on your brush though. And now those rivets pop out like crazy. This advice actually comes to me from Daz, or Darren Latham of GW fame. So shout out to you, Daz. Thanks, man. I also use this mixture of paint to do a little bit of edge highlighting as well, especially on some of the lower elements. Now onto the military green color. First, I start with a base coat of that same dark blue that we used in the skin. Again, I want to harmonize those two parts by using the same shadow color. With the blue down, I'll start to base coat on that military green color, keeping all the blue in the deepest recesses. Normally in my scheme, I just use a brown oil wash over a lot of the model to do the shading, but in this case, when I have a single character, I want to zhuzh it up a little bit and use a more unique shadow color when compared to my normal dudes, but still one that makes sense in the scheme. Next up, let's deal with the black. First, we're just gonna base coat everything that will be black and also silver right now with Citadel's Abaddon Black. I like Abaddon Black a lot because it matches my primer, which is Badger Style Res, a lot in terms of color and also finish. But when it comes to painting the color black for characters and games, I love to use more of a satin paint range, and GW's Citadel paint range is the most satin I own. That extra bit of sheen makes that black look super dark, which is always a challenge when painting black, trying to make the thing actually look black and not gray or something like that. Cleaning up all these details also gives you a much better idea of the current state of your model. It can be really easy to have the wrong take on your paint scheme or the status of your model when all of the unpainted surfaces have a lot of excess brush strokes on them. Every once in a while, just clean up the surrounding areas on the model to get a really good idea of where you're at. Let me jump back in time a little bit, because apparently I'm forgetting my own scheme. I need to add some weathering to his white armor, and we're gonna do that with a dark brown paint that's thinned a decent amount, more than you would for a base coat. Having the paint be thinner increases its flow, making it easier to come off the paintbrush. Some things about chipping you probably already know is you want to add it to where it makes sense, like the edges of details. Some things you may not know is that chipping is a great opportunity to slightly adjust your scheme when you need it. For instance, I think the shading on his armor is a little bit too orange. So what I can do with the chipping is I can focus a little bit of that in the shaded parts, and that will visually reduce the overall orange on the model. Another example of this is I didn't do a great job filling the hole on the back of his backpack. You can still see it. I can distract from this by adding chipping around that area, and that extra visual noise will make it even harder to see that area that I missed. You want a feather touch with this process, using the very tip of your brush to apply small little dots and scratches. Okay, now we can jump back to the black. Now to highlight the black, I'm going to use a blue that is already in my scheme, the same blue that shaded the skin. Again, linking together different parts of the model with common highlights and shadows. It's a strategy I use all the time. I'm gonna messily apply this blue using stippling to the areas of highlight. And I'm gonna go a little overboard here, adding too much blue. While I have this blue out, I'm also gonna base coat some of the cables that are running to his head and his chest. With that scratchy layer of blue down, I now come back with some diluted black paint and paint the edges of that blue to black transition with more scratchy, swipey highlights. I'm sneaking into the blue area to reduce the overall size and create a gradient in between the two. That's why I painted larger blue highlights than I intended for, was because a portion of it was going to become transitioning color. Do a few spins around the model, let the paint dry, come back to it and see what you think. I've probably rotated the model a full 4 times, hitting certain areas multiple times, etc. With that first layer of highlights looking sufficiently scratchy, I move on to the next one by mixing in a much lighter blue color, keeping it in the cold world. Basically, I'm just working inside the highlights that I created, adding more stipply highlights. I should mention that the reason I'm using stipply highlights is twofold. One, I feel like it fits the character of this kind of more grungy guy, but also it's significantly faster than laboring over smooth blends all day long. I'm also using this color as an opportunity to do some edge highlighting as well when appropriate. You'd never see a dark blue color as an edge highlight, so I don't even bother with that step. But on these lighter colors, definitely applicable. When mixing this highlight, I also mixed another highlight a little bit brighter than that one. And I used this final bright light blue highlight on some of the most topmost and prominent details, like the top of his ponytail and also the creases around his corset-like dress thing. It's always surprising how little of a color like this you need to really just make everything pop. You want to be as sparing as possible. I feel like I'm channeling my best John Margiotta with this. And if you don't know John Margiotta, he's an amazing Golden Demon Award-winning painter who paints just the grimiest, gnarliest looking stuff. So much disgusting control. With the black finish, we now have a bunch of small details to paint. I often use a warm brown color for bags and straps and other similar things. So I use that same color that I used to do the scratching on some of the ropes around his waist. There isn't much to do here, just filling in the details. Okay, it is 4:17 on Monday, and I unfortunately have to be done painting. I gotta transfer some of this footage over to another editor I'm working with on this video, and that's Hattie. Yes, that Hattie from Midwinter Mini. She also edited the last video as well. I need to give her some footage, and I also need to get on out of here so I can get to a storage unit, because I'm currently moving houses. Lots going on right now, so unfortunately I'm gonna have to donate some of Tuesday to painting this guy as well. But fortunately, we've painted all of the big stuff and even some of the small things as well. We got the skin done, the black done, the white armor done, and even some of the green and also the brown. So there's very little left to do. So hopefully tomorrow we won't need much time to get this guy finished up. The first thing I did when I came back the next morning was work on the white armor some more. I was feeling really good about how crunchy and delicate all the weathering was looking, so I wanted to add a little bit extra to that white armor with a very sparing, spotty and scratchy edge highlight with pure titanium white. In some areas, I was highlighting under some of the chips. In other areas, I was adding very small volumetric highlights like to his forehead and shoulder. But really what I was mostly doing was just dotting the edges with a little edge highlight. For the teal spot color, I wanted to try something new, so I started with a undercoat of pure white. I'm a big fan of fluorescent colors, especially fluorescent pink, and so I wanted to try out fluo teal, or in this specific case, fluorescent cold green from Vallejo Game Color. After a couple of coats to reach full opacity, it doesn't really seem like much of a special color at all. It might do better over a white undercoat with an airbrush. It's difficult to get a nice consistent base coat with a paintbrush, leading me to have to apply coat after coat, darkening it down further and further, losing some of that vibrancy. For now, I'll just paint all of the teal elements like I normally do. The normal process for the teal starts with a base coat of teal. Shocker, I know. For the larger volumes, like the pods on his back, however, I wanted to work up to teal. So I mixed two transitioning layers in between teal and the dark blue color that I bet you can guess at this point in the video. That's right, the same shadow color I use on the skin and also the green. Keeping it in the family. With the teal down, it's time to do some shading. And because I had that fluo paint on my palette, I decided to try it again for this process. Maybe it'd be better. Turns out the color is a little bit too similar to the current teal and not dark enough, so it's not really doing anything. So I'm gonna move over to what I normally use, which in this case is blue ink. With the cables, I just add a little dab of ink to the connecting point to get an interesting transition of color. Does it make sense that the cable would get darker toward the coupling thing on his chest? Probably not, but it looks cool, and that's what's important. For the pods on his back, I am glazing toward the darker end on the shell. But while doing this, I'm realizing that I'm leaving a tide mark where my brush starts. So I actually changed the orientation of my brush with the bristles pointed toward the backpack instead of perpendicular to it. Try to get more of a transition. Whenever you're doing something like this, it's always important to remember that the final highlight you placed, in this case teal, is only ever going to get smaller because you have to bring this glazing color into that teal, reducing it in size. When compared to a similar detail on my Chronos, these guys look a little bit different because the approach was different, but I think it's okay. They look a little bit more vibrant and fun on this guy. With the shading done, I add just a little bit of highlighting by mixing some white into the teal paint and applying that on the top of his shoulder cable and also the top of the vials on his backpack. Again, it may not make sense, but it's just nice to see a transition on the cables. With the teal done, I moved over to the yellow, and the process is very similar. 1 or 2 highlights and also some shading. I did use more of an orange yellow color in the spirit of the orange found in the cream, trying to balance out a lot of the blue in the scheme. And I did reuse the same orange from earlier as well. Honestly, a lot of this comes down to laziness. I have it on my palette and might as well use it. On to the metallics, and for this I bust out 3 different paints, a dark bluish silver, a medium brightness silver, and also a super bright silver. And I'm not going to use all the paints on all the pieces of silver. For the dark blue silver, I'm going to base coat parts that I know I want to show a transition on, like part of his splinter pistol and also the border of his helmet. And then with the medium silver, I'll start to apply some highlights to those areas I just base coated. Also with this medium silver, I'm base coating his head cable coupling bits. It's too small to see a transition from that dark blue silver to this silver, so I don't even bother with it. And then with the brightest silver, I'm applying very sparing highlights to those areas I just worked on, but I'm also painting the super tiny details, like all the studs and some of the rivets found on the miniature. Stuff that doesn't require much of a transition because it's either too small or not an important detail. Another thing I forgot to do with the white armor is to break out some of it with some yellow panels, like I've done for a lot of my dudes. And so at this point, I just grabbed some contrast paint, Yandin yellow, and painted some of the panels. And because of all of the nice contrast and scratches and weathering, it just looks good as is. For his weapon, I went with a slightly different process. After the dark blue base coat, I did an overbrushing of the medium and then the bright silver to bring out some of the edges and details. When that was done, I soaked the whole thing in Drakenhof Nightshade to really emphasize the blue. When that was done, I did another overbrushing of that medium and then bright silver. And then finally, I finished it off with a crispy, dotty edge highlight of Molotov Chrome, which is a pain to work with, but when you can get it to work, looks really nice like this. I'm not trying to hit every edge with this chrome paint, but just enough to keep it interesting. With that final silver highlight done on the blade, the model is actually finished and we can move on to the base. And I like to keep it simple here. First, I begin with a base coat of an incredibly generic brown looking color. Heck, it's even called Earth. I then base coat the desert flora with that same military green we used on the model. With those base coats dry, I then douse the entire base in a deserty enamel wash. I even thought it was a good idea to flick some of this onto the lower half of the model, but after it dried, it appears that I may have went a little too ham. No problem though, with a little bit of mineral spirits, I can wipe almost all of this away, leaving just a slight whisper of dustiness at the bottom of his battle skirt, or whatever it is. With the enamel wash dry and looking super dusty, I take a combination of yellow, red, and purple ink and airbrush the perimeter of the base. This creates a super hot spot right in the middle, right where the model is, and gives it a really great deserty Martian feel. Lastly, I stuck down some tufts, gave the base rim a nice black paint job, and my custom Archon is finally complete. Hey, look at that, mini family. I actually finished something. Painting single characters is truly my favorite part of painting an army. It's where I came from, it's what I'm most comfortable with, it's what I think I'm best at, and I'm also becoming more and more a fan of doing these kind of more extreme kit bashes. When it comes to Dark Eldar, the Coven aspect of them is actually my least favorite part, but the moment you have a compelling narrative, I'm hooked. I'm in. Let's go muscle daddy Archon. It's such a fun and cool idea and inspired me so much. He matches the Kronos quite well, and while painting him, I thought, oh, maybe the Kronos is like his son that was gonna die and they put him through this awful process to become this hulking monstrosity so that he could live a little bit more. That just seems so dark and twisted in Dark Eldar. I freaking love it. I'm super happy with this Archon, and hopefully I gave you some ideas about how you can take an army painting scheme and crank it up to 11 for your characters. Thanks for checking out week 3 of my Dark Eldar army project. If you missed the first 2 weeks, I'll have them in a playlist linked at the end of the video for you to check out, along with a lot of my other Dark Eldar painting videos. If you like the channel and you want to support it, there are a number of great ways to support the channel. Most notably, checking out my web store, Miniac.co, picking up one of my cutting mats, picking up one of my brush coffins to carry your brushes and style. What are mini painters if not stylish, you know? You can check out my Patreon where you get access to early release videos, some of my thoughts and behind the scenes posts, and also access to my Discord server. All that stuff, including other things like Amazon affiliate links and other ways to support the channel, are linked down in the description below. Subscribe or die! And most importantly, don't forget to paint more minis!